If you're trying to make great sandwiches at home using these imitation Mega Market baguettes, you are doomed to failure. They might have the right shape, but they've got none of the flavor and none of the texture that comes from slow rises that the grocery stores just can't afford. I'm going to show you how to fix that with Demi Baguettes. Super easy from your own home oven. Stay tuned. Hello, baguette fans. I'm Mr. Spork, and these are Mr. Spork's hands. There's a lot of amazing sandwiches out there on the planet, and a lot of them start on top of a good French baguette. Whether you're talking seared tuna, or bacon and French mustard, or the world-famous Vietnamese bahn-mi sandwich, whatever you put on top of them or inside of them, you got to start with great bread. And so I'm going to show you how to do real quick, easy demi-baguettes, basically short baguettes, half-size baguettes, at home, super simple. A lot of people think there's some mystery and science to it, but there really isn't. It's just a little bit of time. And as I always say with bacon breads, the time you invest in making it turns into flavor in the end. So all I've got real quick is some fast-acting yeast, a little bit of salt, a little bit of sugar, 500 grams of bread flour, and because it's really cold in my kitchen today, it's minus 19 Celsius outside, I've got some slightly warmed water. In the summer months, you don't even have to mess with the warm water. Everything can just go straight into the mixing bowl. But today, because it is a little bit cool, I'm going to go ahead and bloom my yeast. I've got my handy-dandy teaspoon measure. I'm going to go in with 2 teaspoons of fast-acting yeast. I've got 1 teaspoon of salt. I'm going to put that straight into the flour. And I've got 2 teaspoons of sugar. I promised a friend of mine in Boston I'd show her exactly how I do my bread, so that's what I'm doing today. I'm going to stir this just a little bit and give it a good, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes to bloom up for me. A lot of people say you've got to have all kinds of crazy specialty devices for making French bread at home, and quite honestly, I've never found that to be true. I use a 10-cent razor straight out of the box for making the relief cuts. I don't need the French razor blade on a stick called a lame. I don't use the rising couche fabric. I don't use the rising baskets. I don't use a transfer board. I just do everything on my good old stock standard half sheet pan. That's a 12 by 18 sheet pan. I just used it so many times it's built up this naturally dark, almost non-stick crust to it. There's really no need for any other special devices. Certainly you can make this by kneading by hand. It is a workout though. You've got to knead it a good 10 or 15 minutes to get the gluten development. I see why some people get nuts for the whole no knead craze, but quite frankly, I don't know why kneading suddenly became a bad thing. Kneading is therapeutic. It's a workout almost. And if you have a machine, it's just flipping a button and coming back 8 or 10 minutes later. So if you don't have a machine, don't worry, you could still do this by hand, but if you do have a machine, it'll make your life a whole lot easier. Okay, so on this cold January morning, you can see that my yeast has bloomed up a fair bit there. Plenty to get us going, jump-started on this cold morning. And again, on summer mornings, I don't even bother with that step, but in the cold winter north here in Canada, sometimes it helps. 500 grams of bread flour in there again. I'm not using all-purpose flour, I'm using bread flour. And yes, it all goes in at once. I turn on the machine medium, and as I told you, these machines really make your life easy. I'm going to give this probably a good 8 or 10 minutes worth of knead on a medium-low setting. And there we go. That's a full 8 minutes of kneading. I know a lot of times it'll look like it's ready at about 6 minutes, but believe me, use a timer. Go ahead and go all the way for 8 minutes of kneading because that extra kneading develops more gluten, gives you more structure to the bread. Now, most of the time I will just go straight into this same bowl with a little bit of oil, throw it in the oven, let it rise, but because you guys are special, I'm going to go ahead and pull it out into a separate bowl here, a separate clean bowl, if you will. Just a little tiny bit of oil, vegetable oil, olive oil, whatever you got handy is fine. I'm going to pull this very sticky dough out and use my handy dandy plastic scraper here. If you don't have one of these plastic scrapers, I think it's a very wise 50-cent investment. But very sticky dough, but that's to be expected because, again, it's a very wet dough. I should have mentioned earlier, that's 370 milliliters of water that I used to 500 grams of bread flour. 370 milliliters of water. hot or cold depending on the day. And as always, these recipes will be up on my blog. If you go up to that link in the corner there, you will find all the craziness from my kitchen and the exact measurements, but a little bit of oil just to coat so it doesn't form a skin. I'm going to go ahead and put a cover over this and let it rise in a warm spot. Again, on a cold day, go into your oven, close the door, turn it on for 60 seconds, and turn it back off. That makes a nice warm proofing oven. I'll see you back here in about an hour and a half of rise, or double in size. So here we are after a good hour and a half rise. We've certainly more than doubled in size, ready to make the first stage of baguette shaping. So scrape all of this out. It's a really wet dough. I'm going to use just a tiny little bit of flour here, just barely any at all. For the later stages of forming, I'll actually use oil instead of flour. But since this is such a wet dough, you can get away with a little bit of extra flour here. And all I want to do is fold it a little bit, knocking some of that air down. Now I want to get into 6 equal portions. And then form them into nice tight balls. Almost like making steamed buns, basically. You really want to tuck them in well. But don't sweat the details too much because you've got one more stage of forming after this. Again, I'm going to give my little parking area a good dust of flour, but I'm not going to roll them in that flour. I just want that flour on there to keep them from spreading too much. I want them to rise up, not out. And the idea of pinching it tight like that is that we're forming basically a skin, and that skin traps and holds in some of the interesting bubbles for the later forming. Sometimes you think you might have too many bubbles. That's okay. We'll take care of that in the next stage. That was a little small, so probably could have used a scale to even these up, but so what? Somebody will get one slightly smaller sandwich. So there we go. Now we're just going to make sure and give them plenty of space. And again, I'm using this flour not so much to dry them out inside the texture of the bread, but to keep them from spreading a little too much. So there we go. 6 buns. I'm going to cover these up and let them rise for another hour and a half. After that last hour's worth of rise, my buns are ready to be formed. As you can see that they've once again just about doubled in size. And what we're going to do here, we're going to prep and go onto our actual baking sheet. Now I've just used a aluminum baking sheet that's got a nice built-up crust on it that's kind of almost non-stick. And I put a little bit of flour on here. And again, the flour isn't to dry out the bread, it's to stop it from spreading out. We want it to rise up rather than horizontally, as it were. So that pan is prepped and ready. I'm just going to move my buns over out of the way here and do them one at a time. And instead of extra flour on my work surface, I'm just going to do a little tiny bit of oil here. Spread that around. And here's how you deflate this. You see it's beautifully risen, but believe it or not, you want to knock that down as much as you can. Some people will use a rolling pin. I don't personally. I just do it by hand. And I get a diameter on here about the length of the bun that I'm after, because again, we're going to rise up, not out. And once we've got it pounded out the way we want, here's the little trick. You roll it up, and you roll and seal very well. You pinch that seam closed if you need to or want to. And just like a regular full-size baguette, for these rolls, we want them to taper a little bit down on the ends. And that is all there is to it. I'm going to take them seam side down, and I'm going to place them over here onto my tray. And again, I'm going to leave plenty of space in between. Let me do another one for you here real quick. Just a drop or two of oil. A bun off of the intermediate rise, and again pound it down to get a lot of those bubbles out. We're, believe it or not, leaving some in. Get it to about the diameter of the length of the bun. I hope that made sense. That's some serious bread geometry there. I want the diameter to be about as long as the length of bun I'm trying to make. Just working it. And again, if you want to use a rolling pin, you can. A lot of people do. I just happen to like my fingers more. Give it a roll up. Roll those tapered ends. A little pinch if necessary. And onto our tray. And again, these are definitely going to at least double, so give them plenty of space. In fact, on this, what is this, a 18 by 12 pan, I'll probably only do 3 or 4 at a shot, and I'd rather do several trays in succession rather than trying to cram them in too much. So going to let these rise for, again, about another hour in a nice warm spot. I'll cover them with a tea towel, and we will end up with buns in no time. All right, after our last hour's worth of rise over in the warm proofing oven, as you can see, we're ready to go. I've got myself a super sharp, straight out of the box razor. I'm going to use this to make some relief cuts on the top of the bread so that they will poof up, as it were. You could certainly buy the French device called a lame, which is basically a razor blade on a stick, but hey, a 10-cent razor blade works perfectly well. And I'm also going to use a little bit of water here. I'm going to mist the tops of these. This is on my super fine sprayer. This is going to help form the crust. And if there's any trick to using the razor blade, it's basically to be fast. I'm just going to do 1, 2, 3, and I'm not going to bother with trying to make a curve or anything. So 1, 2, 3. Sometimes you get all the way through, sometimes you don't. That's okay. Let's say there's a trick, it's to kind of be fast, and sometimes I don't get it all the way, but there we go. I'm going to do one more over there. So those little relief cuts are going to do perfectly well. Don't worry if they're not perfect. The cooking time in the oven will make them poof up. The other thing in the oven, remember I've got it fully preheated, cranked it up to 500 degrees for a full 20 minutes, so it's nice and hot. I'm going to knock it back down to about 475 Fahrenheit. The other thing to make this a beautifully crisp crust on the outside is to get a little bit of steam in the environment, and you can do that by throwing a few ice cubes on the bottom deck of the oven. Absolutely, certainly can do that, but hey, it's Canada, so I'm just going to throw a cup of snow on the bottom of the oven, and that will create, again, that steamy environment that you really want. 475 degrees, probably anywhere from 20 to 25 minutes. Normally I would have you bake it half the time and rotate it, but in this case I want to keep all that heat in, so just put them in and don't touch them. You can watch them through the window, but don't open that oven again. I'll be back with some finished French rolls in just a second. So I am back from the oven with some beautiful French mini baguettes or Vietnamese sandwich rolls, whatever you want to call them. I'm just going to temp them real quick. We're right at 200 degrees or so, which is what we want. Beautifully light and airy, but you do definitely want to let these cool down completely before you turn them into sandwiches. In fact, they're usually even better the second day. So day-old baguettes are perfectly fine in the sandwich world. After those baguettes cooled off completely, I went ahead and popped them into a giant plastic bag for storage, but don't do that until they've cooled completely, because any steam that accumulated in there would ruin that beautifully crisp crust that you worked so hard to attain. I dusted these with a little bit of extra flour. Some people use a little bit of cornmeal dusting on the top and bottom when they're baking, and that's perfectly fine too. But without any preservatives in this, other than just a bit of oil and salt, I'd say they're good for 3 or 4 days, and after that you can turn them into bread pudding or bread crumbs. Always useful to have around the house. But quite frankly, after you've tasted a few great sandwiches on this stuff, I doubt that you end up with any surplus at all. Whether you're going to make a meatball sandwich with lots of extra sauce, or a muffalata from the French Quarter in New Orleans, or a Vietnamese bahn-mi, or a bacon and French mustard sandwich, or one of my favorites, sun-dried tomato and fresh buffalo mozzarella, smoked mozzarella if you can find it. Those are all great sandwiches, and they all start with great bread. You will not make good sandwiches until you make good bread. There's a blizzard bearing down on me up here in Canada today, so I'm going to go make some fried egg and Parmesan sandwiches for my own little picnic in front of the giant window as I watch it snow. I appreciate you watching today, as always, and I appreciate you thumbs upping and liking and subscribing and all that other crazy YouTube stuff that happens. I especially appreciate you watching the ad that runs after this, because that's what lets me keep doing this for you guys. If you need any of the details for this recipe or all my other craziness coming out of Canada, just go up to the blog link in the corner and you will get more than you ever bargained for. Everything from pictures of my neighbor's goats to videos of the farm and all kinds of recipes and ramblings from a crazy Canadian. I'm going to go sit in front of the window and watch that blizzard. You go make some sandwich bread. I'll see you next time. Cheers.